Well, I think we'll go ahead and get started as we're seeing more people join in. Welcome to our quarterly technical session. Western Dakota Regional Water hosts these as informational events on a quarterly basis to provide more information to our members and to the public at large who is interested in learning more about this engineering and science around water systems. Our project, as you may know, is underway thanks to the funding that we've received through the state of South Dakota, the legislature appropriating American Rescue Plan Act dollars, as well as the state's own funds, which requires a local match. And all of our local members have been enthusiastically stepping forward with funding to make that match. We are underway with developing a feasibility study about this project. That effort was boosted this last week with a new piece of legislation that Senator Thune introduced for Bureau of Reclamation authorization of the feasibility study. We have enjoyed the support and help from the entire congressional delegation. Senator Rounds a month ago introduced another piece of legislation which will help us along those lines, called the reauthorization of the Rural Water Supply Act. This afternoon, our educational program is presented by Ken McCarron. Ken is a senior environmental engineer with KLJ, one of our partners as part of the engineering team. He has experience as a consultant and academic researcher and has overseen several projects with environmental permitting, environmental assessments, wetland assessments, ecosystem surveys, mapping endangered and threatened species, and restoration mitigation throughout North America and on international projects as well. Ken has worked with multiple federal agencies, state and local agencies as well on various projects. And we're pleased to have you this afternoon, Ken, to tell us a little bit about NEPA, what it is, and what it means for this project. Take it away.
All right, thanks everyone. Give me a thumbs up. You can hear me all right? Thank you. As Cheryl did, thanks for the introduction. My background, I started off in academia and got into consulting about 20 some years ago. And what I like about consulting is it's applied. Before I was doing that, I was here in Colorado. This is where I'm at now. I'm in Denver, the Denver area, and I taught down in a small school in Alamosa, Colorado. And we would talk about regulations such as NEPA and stuff on the academic level. And I'm trying to get students to understand this, to go out in the world and be profitable and live their lives doing and understanding these policies. And I got a lot of feedback. And so it would be interesting if I get feedback on this, because I'm going to kind of take some of the things from 20 years ago when I was teaching a class, co-taught a class with a friend of mine, and we talked about what NEPA is. Now, you know, I would start in my class with the NEPA process and put this flow chart up there. And I would look around the room and my students would start to fall asleep. And as I started to go into what I was saying in the slide, they had no context. And I finally started asking, I was like, what can I do better? You know, we need to talk about this process, but what can I do better? And they're like, well, we want to know what NEPA is. And you're just jumping right into it. So I said, okay, what is NEPA? And I threw this slide up and they just literally look at me again like I was crazy. Like, you want us to read all of this? And I said, well, this is actually the welcome statement that if you go to nepa.gov, I just took the text out of the little blurry box on the right and stuck it on the screen the best I could. This is what you're faced with. There's a lot of information here, but out of context, it kind of feels like you're about to do your taxes. because you're going to try to go through that, and you're trying to figure out, well, I want to develop this project, and I want to work with the environment, and I've got the government here telling me I have to go through this process. I feel like at this point in time, I might as well be just doing my taxes, and I'll get as much out of it as when I do my taxes. Maybe I'll get a return. But it was confusing. And my students like, no, 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 there's too many words in the slide. But can you help us out? I said, yeah, maybe it's not so much what is NEPA, it is why is NEPA. Instead of knowing what NEPA is, really, why do we have to go through this process? So what is NEPA? And to do that, and I hate to be academic, but that's where my foundations are, kind of go back and do a history lesson. I promise it'll be a brief history lesson, but we have to look where we came from. We all now exist in 2024. Our perspective on this world is whatever our age is and our adult age, that we've actually maybe thought about how we're impacting the environment. And maybe some people don't think about it at all. If you're in this talk, I'm assuming you have an interest in understanding how NEPA works. So we need to go back to our foundations. So let's go back pre-industrial revolution. I looked it up online. 1790s is the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. Prior to that, we are an agrarian society. We live on farms. We have roughly about 4 million people here, and I think that number is an underestimation because we're missing a population that was here before us. And but let's say there's about 5 million-ish people in this continent. Our impacts are local. You have a farm, you have a village, you're producing waste, your animals are producing waste, and it rains and it washes away. It goes into the water and goes downstream, and you don't see it again. You don't worry about it. Your neighbors may not be very happy about that, but then they just throw it in. Their next door neighbors downstream might get it, but it's localized impacts in our environment. We don't really have regulations this time about what to do. We're just figuring out how to be a country. Let's jump 110 years later. And I just chose 1900 because I had pictures. And I figured that's when we know the Industrial Revolution has been underway. We've been through a couple of wars by that time. We've been through a growth spurt. We are now not just 5 million people, we're 76, take that up to about 80 million people, probably in this country. And our population densities have gotten higher. We've also, most of us now don't live in an agrarian system. Most of us, half of us, live in cities and urban environments that have nothing to do with agriculture. We're working in mines, we're working in factories, we work in cities, and our waste is more concentrated. Our impact on the environment is regional now. It's not just localized and it goes down the stream, it's regionalized. The problem is we're still working with 1790 technology as far as what to do with that waste. It goes down the stream, we don't worry about it, it goes to the next village, let them worry about it, or the next country, or it goes to the ocean. We don't have to worry about it. Let's just hide it. And that's where we are. So as a society, our environmental policies are, I don't see it, not a problem to me, it's your problem. But we're having issues with cities and smoke. Our air quality is going down. We know we're having impacts on the vegetation. We know we have impacts on wildlife. We do have scientists at this time who are seeing this. But for the most part, it isn't a discussing topic. Let's jump 60 years later. Our population has increased by 100 million people. That's a staggering growth. A lot of this is immigration. It's us having kids. It's us getting better at being the United States, and we have a higher population density. And you can see it here in this picture. 70% of us now live in urban environments and don't deal with agriculture. 70% of us are tied to some type of industry, company, stores, trade, something, but we're not the people producing anymore. And we are now not affecting the environment regionally, I mean, locally, regionally, and now globally, we're seeing issues. We're now starting to see the environment pushing back. We have spent roughly 200 years, before the Industrial Revolution also, working with this environment, living under the same regulations the whole time, which is barely any. If it's hidden, if it's not my way, it's not an issue. And you can see stockpiling happening. You see smog. For those people who don't remember smog, it is pollution and fog together. Still have it here, but not as bad. It's New York City, 1900 or 1960s. And we're starting to see some of the effects of our management processes. This is the Cuyahoga River, and this is a famous photo. I realized you guys can't see where I'm pointing. Let me turn the laser pointer on. There we go. Now you can see where I'm pointing. Here's the Cuyahoga River, which is in Cincinnati. And in 1952, it catches on fire. By the way, it catches on fire 4 more times. This is just one picture. I'm not sure which fire this was, but the water is so polluted because our methods of dealing with resources are put it in the river, it goes downstream, it isn't my responsibility anymore, has caused companies just to dump willy-nilly. We don't have regulations, and we have got so many toxic chemicals in this water. There are no fish, and the river catches on fire. This is just one picture. The Mississippi is having this, Missouri, quite a few other rivers are having this issue. This is just a famous picture, and this is the 1950s. In 1962, Rachel Carson produces a book, or publishes a book called Silent Spring, and it's famous. It's famous for kind of opening up our eyes to an issue. And this was pesticide use. I don't know how many people here remember DDT. A lot of the younger people are not going to know DDT anymore. It's something you might see in a history book. But for the longest time, DDT was the main pesticide we used on crops. We used to get rid of anything you can think of insect-wise. We put it in our hair to get rid of lice. It was the chemical to use. It's also a carcinogen. It also causes death. It also impacts the environment, and that's what Rachel Carlson is talking about, is that DDT, we all know about the American bald eagle. Why is the American bald eagle an issue? People weren't necessarily hunting that. It was because of chemicals like this were weakening the shell of that species. So that species populations were going downhill as the young were not viable. So DDT was removed from our history probably in the 1970s, and we haven't really talked about it since. It's a regulation, it's something that's been successful. But we are now living with the weight on our shoulders of 200 years of our environmental issues. If we look at major environmental regulations and legislation, in that page, I didn't point it out, NEPA likes to call itself the first environmental policy. And that is false. The first environmental policies are back in the 1800s. We realized we had problems and people had to work together. It just didn't have a lot of teeth. This first one that I've got on here, 1899, is the River and Harbors Act. We still use that today. That was a point in time where there was so much garbage in our navigable waters and our harbors that they had to say, stop throwing your stuff in the water. We got to get the boats through. And that's what really that was all about, is don't put more stuff in the water. Not so much pollution, just that hard stuff we can't get around with our boats. But we were seeing impacts. We see the Migratory Bird Treaty Act in 1918. Even before we're seeing other issues, we're starting to realize the bird populations are showing an effect. And this was a treaty for us to work with Canada and Mexico, that we would do something so that we weren't impacting migratory birds so much from hunting and other things, but that we would come to an agreement on how to work together. So we do early on see some of these acts. This Federal Water Pollution Control Act, and I promise I'm not going through each of these, just the first three, was our first attempt of the government to say, okay, we got an issue. We got pollution in the water, our water stinks, the fish are dying, people are being affected even at that point in time. You guys need to stop. And that's basically what that law is. You guys being the states, you have the authority to fix this. Each state, come up with your own policy, you figure it out. The federal government will watch. And it didn't work out well because we're still using the same technology, which is if I put it in the Ohio River and it goes away from my state and it goes to the next state down, I don't have to worry about it. And that's how that regulation was being worked. It didn't work out. A lot of these are early. The Clean Air Act you can see in 63. Well, NEPA was started in 1969, and it was basically to say, okay, we've got issues, we got to work together. We got to figure out how to get everybody to work together, and we've got to come up with some type of policy where we rein this in. Otherwise, we're going to have a lot of just random stuff and random regulations. Could we work together? And how are we going to work within this environment of increasing regulations? That's what NEPA is kind of designed for, is to us to put our heads down and think about this. And you can see in the 70s, 72, 74, 75, 76, we're throwing a lot of regulations in here. These are not because somebody in 1960 decided the environment was important. These are reactive regulations. This is us saying in 200 years, we've caused so many problems, and these problems keep showing up. We need to figure this out. One, we need to stop what we've been doing in the 200 years and figure out how we can work forward. And that's why this pulse in regulations happen, is we're now consciously looking at what we're doing to the environment. They actually work. They may be overbearing in a lot of ways. They may be confusing, but they actually work. This is the Cuyahoga River in the 1950s. This is the Cuyahoga River in, I think, 1995. I stole the picture off a website. People are canoeing in it. There are fish in that river. It has recovered. The Clean Water Act is working. It may not please us all how it's getting done, and it's not perfect water, but it's working. We as a society, we as a country are coming together and thinking, all right, how can we make this better? Because future generations are going to have issues. All right, so that gets us into a lot of regulations, and they're good, but it doesn't tell us what NEPA is. So what I've tried to do is set the framework of, we've created this issue, we've created this problem. How do we now deal with it? How do we look forward? How do we work together? And that's where this slide comes back. And I could literally teach a semester on this slide. I won't do that today, I promise. But I could. That slide has a lot of information. I would like to go through some of it, so I'm going to break it down. All right, what is NEPA? The first part talks about in 1969, a bunch of people got together, some very smart, intelligent people. One of the guys I got to see in a lecture, which was awesome, talk about the process. And in 1970, Richard Nixon signed this into law. It did two things, really. It said, we need a council of environmental quality, and they're going to oversee and check on our country to see how we do with the environment. So that's the first thing it did. You don't ever hear about the CEQ unless you're really into the weeds on this. You rarely hear them in the news. They're kind of in the background watching us, but they are the overseers of this. Who really has the strength is we also set the foundation of the Environmental Protection Agency, who gets all the responsibility of making sure we're doing this. So we got a watchdog group, and we have kind of the muscle behind it to get this done. We got to work together. Now, I've highlighted the word federal action. Before we were trying to get the states to do everything. This doesn't direct the states necessarily. Everything you do has to follow this regulation. It does say that any federal action, anything that we do federally or has a federal nexus tied to it, interstate systems, national parks, BLM, all these agencies and stuff have federal actions. That's where NEPA comes in. You're building your house in your neighborhood and it's on state land and it's not going to be a NEPA process. But federal actions. But it does set the foundation that we need to assess the environment. The boulder here wasn't just a picture of some friends doing this. It was to kind of remind us that we aren't looking at the 1960s moving forward. We're looking at 200 years of what we did prior that we have to deal with. That is also NEPA's responsibility. Look backwards, look forward, and look at today. All those are important. Love Canal, for those who remember the 1970s, this was big in the news. Love Canal is a great example of this. Love Canal was a canal that was written by, was designed by an engineer named Love. It was never completed. It was in New York. And one of the chemical companies in the 1920s saw this crevice in the ground and thought, this is a great place to dump our chemicals. So it dumped all its chemicals in there, did it for 20 years. In the 1940s, it was done, put some soil over it. Can't see it anymore. We're good, thumbs up, let's move on. We need to get rid of this land. So they sold it to $1 to a developer. And that developer put a neighborhood on there. And that neighborhood grew in New York and for 25 years existed. And then they started noticing the people in this neighborhood at a high rate were dying, that cancer, that children weren't surviving, that people weren't able to come to term with pregnancies. And there was an issue. And then when the ground started kind of oozing some of those chemicals, because the containers they put them in, the metal containers had dissolved, it became an issue. And it became what's called the first Superfund site. And it's always a name that's been out there. People are like, why is it called Superfund? Because it's basically we're going to throw everything we can at it to clean it up. It's that toxic. Moved everybody out. And this became one of the first success stories to some extent. This land is never going to be used again. The chemicals in it are so nasty that there are areas that we'll never touch again until those chemicals break down. But that is not something that happened in the 1970s moving forward. It's something that we're living in our legacy. Just as a reminder. Back to this. So we've got a lot of regulations here. NEPA, how does it fit in? Well, NEPA ends up being kind of the umbrella of this approach. It takes all those regulations together, and if there's a federal act or a federal nexus to a project, it takes all those regulations under itself and says, you will look at these, the ones that apply. But NEPA itself isn't the experts. Some of these may be more a highway project, or maybe it's a USDA project, agriculture, or it's a Forest Service project, or a Park Service, or it's a Corps of Engineers. So we need to kind of find who is our experts here, and they become kind of the authority and lead agency in this, with NEPA giving that foundation. So that's important. So a lot of regulations, NEPA is in charge of kind of reining this in, but we need help. That's our lead agency. Going down that slide, I'm starting to block out areas we don't need to see, plus I need to place this my graphics. There's section 101. Section 101 sets the stage for what NEPA does. It says to use all practical means and measures. I'm going to give some more words here: financially technical assistance. Basically, what you're going to do is you want to put this business, this factory, this pipeline, whatever you want, into the environment, and it has a federal driver to it. Then we want you to look at it and make sure it fits in well, not just fits in pretty, but it fits in the environment and doesn't harm the environment or the social economic. What's cool about this, social and economic centers, is just not just environmental. And one of the, I think to me, after years of studying this, was really important. The people who designed this put man in here. We are part of the environment. This isn't just for a bunny or a bug or something like that. It's for all parts of the environment, including us as a society. So it ends up being an investigation research project. Can you put your project in there? You're going to have to do some work. It's also, what's really cool is it's a planning document. If you're an engineer and you're designing, you want to get this started, because this will help you understand how it fits in the environment, how you can work with it. So it's a planning document. And that's what that's setting the stage for. But again, it isn't just the natural and human environment. It's other resources. What about our historic and cultural resources? They're important to us. It has to be part of that. The social economic, our businesses. We can't have a company come in and it disrupt our economic and social environment. We need to look at that also. Is it going to help or hurt? All these are balanced. And also the abiotic, the parts that aren't living, the water, the air, the minerals. How is it going to affect the landscape itself? All these have to go into the NEPA process. It's just not environmental. So as we want to put a water pipeline in, we're looking at all these aspects. And again, future generations. So I highlighted some things here. All right, I want to stop here for a second and put two words out here, because I hear this a lot when people ask about NEPA. They're like, you guys just want to preserve everything. I'm like, no, I'm an ecologist. I studied ecology. My doctorate's in ecology. And I'm a conservationist. Conservationist is the wise use of the land, or seeks a proper use of nature. We are part of the environment. We live here. Our society needs to grow. We need to be part of that environment. I'm a conservationist. But there are going to be projects that are so bad, or areas that are so sensitive, that maybe we need to preserve them. National parks, wildlife refuge, and things like that, that we need to say, hold on, maybe we can still utilize them to a lesser extent. That's more the preservation. That's not the goal to be one or the other. It's to vet what is the best thing for us to do in this environment. So this is not a slanted argument. All right, section 102 of NEPA sets the framework of, all right, now you told us we have to do this, but how? And a little paragraph there isn't much, but there's a lot to that. And it's, how do we take, I want to put this business into the environment and it's all going to work out well. Okay, if it's a NEPA, it has a federal nexus, you're going to go and vet all of this before you get here, so that we know we're making and doing the right decision. So it lays the foundation. I'm going to take those bullet points that are in yellow and put them in the next slide and bring them out, talk about them individually or in groups at least. So let's look at 1, 2, and 3. The first one is, you have a proposed action. That's, I want to build something. Okay. What's the effect on the environment? If you put it in the environment, is it going to be detrimental? In the environment, it suffers. If the environment suffers, we suffer, and so on down the line. We're all connected. So that's not what we want. Or is there a way in which you put that business or what we're trying to build into the environment and it works with the environment to the point where it's sustainable? That's what that first part is. Are you doing that? So that's part of our research. The other is any adverse effects that can't be avoided. Avoidance, maybe I should have bolded that word, is also important. Sometimes avoiding an issue is the best thing. Move the factory over slightly, don't put it there. And that's where you look at alternatives. If you want to build this, sure. But if it's got a federal driver and you're going to go through the NEPA process, you're going to give us alternatives. We're going to figure out which one works best. And by the way, I haven't mentioned something here, public. The public is involved in this, and I'll get to that. So if you've got a factory and you can change how that factory works, and that if you change the way that factory works, it fits into the environment better, hey, that's an alternative. Or maybe don't put it in here, the hills, put it down here with the grassland. Maybe the environment you choose to put this activity, if you can, these aren't absolute, they're ifs, you can, maybe that'll allow, and that with these changes, you can move forward with what you want to do, and it has the least impact on the environment. So we're thinking ahead before we build, which is not something we did for 200 years. All right. Sometimes putting your factory into the landscape just don't fit. It's not going to work. Sometimes your alternative is don't do it. And we will vet why. And it will be something that won't be just because we feel like it. It'll be because. And we'll have the evidence and facts to prove it. This is scientific, in a sense, the approach of can we build something in our society and our environment be sustainable and exist for our future generations. Now, moving on to the bottom part, this is one of the parts I like the best. This is what an ecologist does. We look at the environment and see how things. So I'm an ecophysiologist. My PhD is in ecophysiology. I'm a stress ecologist. I look at environments and I know how much stress they can take environmentally from whatever we're talking about, climate change or flooding, you name it. I want to understand how that affects the environment. This literally is that. We're going to look at a project in its short-term effects, local versus long-term effects. You put that factory there and you take it out 10 years later, what have you done to the environment? Is it something that's irreversible or is it permanent? So these two statements here allow us to kind of look at the environment. Being an ecologist, this reminds me of what's called the rivet hypothesis. This was done by Paul Ehrlich when he was in the war in the Vietnam. He was flying on a plane and he was sitting there getting transported around. And he's staring at the wall and he noticed some of the rivets in the plane were missing. And he's like, oh, this is great. I'm being flown around the plane that's falling apart. And his comment was, how many rivets could I take away from this plane and it still fly? And years later, as an ecologist, as a scientist, he thought, how much can I take away from the environment and the environment actually exist as a whole or function? And it became the rivet hypothesis. How much can we take away from the environment? Or in a sense, how much impact can we put on the environment and still sustainable and function? That's what cumulative effects looks like. It is this factory being put into this environment. This works great. That's one effect. My factory didn't do anything to your environment or our environment, not just yours, our environment, and it works out great. Another person wants to come in and say, hey, I like what you did. I want to do the same thing. Let's put in another factory. But now we got two, and there are effects where one isn't very much. The second one isn't very much, but together, you might be stressing your environment out a little bit, but right now it's still sustainable and we're good. And then somebody says, hey, I've got an idea. Let's put some more stuff in here in this environment. That accumulative effect of looking at things that exist in an environment could have a detrimental effect. So if we want to put something in the environment, what was there before us? Who else is there? Who is established? The cities, the towns, the people, the other factories, and their effect on this environment. And if we put it in, are we the straw that breaks the camel's back? We want to make sure we're not. So in a sense, we want to look at cumulative effects, not only what we did, but what has been done in the past, what's happening now, and also what's going to happen in the future. What happens if we put something in? What will it do to the population of an area? What will it do to the wildlife? We want to think of the future. So it is something that has to look to temporally across the time scale. So that's what I like about that process. As an ecologist, it fits right in my mindset. All right, the last part of that slide is I'm not exactly thrilled about how they wrote this, because it says here that NEPA and sure, the agencies consider significant effects. Yeah, we're going to all work together. That was said earlier. But inform the public is not how it's written. The forming the public, it is the public is part of the process. This feels very like, we'll tell you what we're going to do. No, the public is part of the process. So I'm not really thrilled with that line right there, because that's not how NEPA is set up. The public is part of this process. And I'll get to that in a second. What I did think is kind of funny here is they give themselves some big credit here. NEPA making NEPA an international catalyst in the field of environmental protection. kind of grandiose. Actually, that statement's true. In 1970, when this all happened, the rest of the world was looking for answers also. This isn't just something we did in the United States. Everywhere was having issues. And other countries watched us. We actually are, the international communities use a version of NEPA. We're going to talk about environmental impact statements, which is a document we create here. They do create environmental impact assessments. So I worked in Canada, I've worked in Africa, and I'm still working with the NEPA process in other countries because they copied us. So in a sense, that grandiose statement's kind of true. There are other countries with other environmental policies that work well. But the public needs to be part of this. And this was something very, very much in the minds of the people who created this. In the freeway revolts, which I'm not old enough to remember, but I've been told about, in the 1950s, they realized they wanted to come up with the infrastructure to get people to move around with cars and stuff, and they get the freeways. They decided, the people who had power were like, I don't really want this in my neighborhood, but there's that other neighborhood over there. Those people don't care. They don't have as much money. We're going to stick the highway there. And that's what happened here. I think this might be Boston. I can't remember where this was, where they decided just to rip down the poorer neighborhoods and put their freeways in. Well, revolt started. Obviously, you don't want your home. You have no say. The government just comes in and takes. This isn't good. And so this taught some lessons in the 1950s and early 60s that was in the mind of those who created NEPA, that the public, and this is actually a review right here of a NEPA document, the public needs to be informed and part of the process. You get your chance to be in this. If you're in this talk, you have some stake in this. So inform the public? No, the public is part of it. You are going to be informed. To the extent, and I put this on here, and this is the first QR code I've ever created in my life. I tried it last night. It seems to work. It will take you to a document that is published by the government. It's called a Citizen's Guide to NEPA. And it pretty much outlines a lot of the things I've talked about, but not in the details that I'm giving now. There's a lot more details about the process. And it's a pretty well written document. There's a ton of information online that will augment this. But if you are interested in what we are doing, what others are doing that have a federal nexus, again, that have the environment of NEPA, this is your voice. Have your voice in this. And you're in the process. I'm going to show you that in a second. But anyways, I'm going to move on. If you didn't get this, you can just look up Citizens Guide to NEPA. Make sure you get the newest one. It's 2021. There's older ones as they get revised periodically. So back to my original slide, which I probably won't talk about as much here, is the NEPA process. And it's kind of a convoluted process, but you now understand the foundations that we need to do research. We need to be looking at causal effects. We need to be looking at alternative analysis. That's a fancy word, but what that means is you're going to look at various other aspects of how we can do it. We're going to look at impact analysis. What much impact are we going to put on the environment if we do this? And how is it accumulative with other things? Maybe there's things, I didn't talk about mitigation as much. Maybe there's things we can do to offset this. So mitigations become part of the process. But the idea is that you have coordination with the agencies, that everybody's informed, and that you have public involvement. I'm going to click one more slide over as I continue here. There are three main documents in the NEPA process: category exclusion, environmental assessment, and environmental impact statement. And I always thought they were created together, and actually they weren't. Originally, the environmental assessment didn't exist. It was a category exclusion or environmental impact statement. It wasn't until later we created the middle ground one. And the idea behind these documents is that if you have an impact that's quite small, say we have a national park, they have a dirt parking lot that they want to pave. Believe it or not, that will cause NEPA to come into play, because you're making some impact to the environment within the federal environment, you're using federal dollars, but it's so insignificant, the fact that we're just paving it. And yes, the water might actually be clear, so they could be beneficial. The category exclusions are exclusions. Are there activities we can basically say have no impact and then move on? We file these papers because we need to think about accumulative effects. We need to keep records of what we've done to the environment. So this is a record keeping process that we're not ignoring it. It's part of the process, but it has very small. And this is over here, you can see our environmental effects likely to be significant. If no, I put it in purple for category exclusion. You can see it's a quick process. The stars here where public gets involved, these don't generally get involved because there would be a ton of them as we're paving a lot of parking lots, we're paving roads, or we're building things that are part of the infrastructure, maintenance and things like that. The middle ground document is called an environmental assessment. And that is where, is the event you're doing, the product you want to build or whatever, going to have some type of effect to the environment? And if you can't say no, because it's minimal, and there could be some effect that we don't know, we don't think so, we're probably going to do the middle ground one, which is an environmental assessment. So the impacts are not clear, but it evaluates the alternatives and make sure we're doing our ground. This is where the public gets involved. So we go ahead and we develop an environmental assessment, and the public gets a chance to review this. And the reason I think the public at this point is important is they live there. You're putting this in there, and this may be some company coming in that doesn't know the environment, and they do know their environment. They're going to raise awareness to things you're not thinking about. So as an engineer building something, this is extremely important to get the public involved, because did you guys think about this or this? Because they have that intimate knowledge of the environment. Let's get them part of this. This is supposed to be a shorter process. These papers are about 75 pages long. The amount of time you have on this is a lot less. The goal here is to show that there's no significant impact on the environment, and that we can basically say, hey, this is a finding of no significant impact, can be put out there, and we can move on with the decision. Again, the public is involved in that to some extent. The larger ones, and this is a document that says, okay, we don't think we have any impacts, but we're probably going to have some impacts. This is a large pipeline. We're probably going to cross some federal lands, and there's some endangered species, and oh my God, there's a lot of things going on. We need to be looking at something like an environmental impact statement. These are bigger documents. These can take years to develop, and that timeline has been cut down to make them more efficient, but it's a lot of research. So we are going to go through that whole process that I've talked about. We're going to look, and we're going to say, hey, by the way, we're going to do this. This is our notice of intent, and that the public is going to know about this. So before we even get started with designing, we need to have an idea and then get in front of the public and say, hey, we would like to do the following. We want you guys to be involved in this process before we decide how it's going to be built. So public involvement starts early in this case because the impacts could be large. We take all that information, we draft this large document called an environmental impact statement, and gets into draft. It then gets reviewed by the lead agency. And again, we need the public, hey, we listened to you once before, now we've designed it, we've got some alternatives, we need you to look at our alternatives. You're part of that process too. Once that's been done, we've addressed comments, we've gotten through the agencies, we finalize that EIS, which is a large document, and then it goes and the public gets to know what we did. And this is the final EIS. The public, I guess I forgot to put a star there, is also involved in the availability and to review. There are websites, and I did not put them in this talk, but you can look. There are whole databases of these, depending on the lead agency. And then a record of decision. Because a project, I want this to be emphasized, because a project we think is a great idea, because we're the developer, or I'm not the developer, I'm making myself into this, but let's say I'm the developer, just because I think it's a good idea doesn't mean that it is. And the record of decision doesn't always lean towards us working. There are times, and in many cases, where an EIS has said, nope, we're done. You're not building this. The impact to the environment is too much. This, or the social economic structure, or all those factors, or the cultural resources here are too valuable and too sensitive that we have to stop. So it doesn't always a yes. That record of decision can be a no. But it also talks about what the alternatives are.
And so, Ken, I might just add too, just for everybody today, this is very much down the road in terms of a project. We're so early in the process. We don't even have a lead agency. Oh, thank you. Yeah.
you guessed ahead.
And yeah, and so I'll let you continue, and then I may jump in again. All right.
All right. I'm getting long-winded here, so I want to watch my time, and I'm going to kind of fly through the next slides. But you just answered this slide. I was going to say, we're not here yet. We're not at the NEPA stage. We are pre-NEPA stage, which That isn't really a thing. We're just not there yet. So we're not in this process. We will get there. And I can guarantee you it'll be one of these two. It's not going to be a category exclusion. But we're in the vetting stages. So I'm part of the environmental team. I'm gonna fly through some slides here because I'm looking at time. This was from a different talk that was given earlier. I didn't, that I made the slides. I didn't get a chance to give the talk, but we're in the vetting stage. We're in the critical issues analysis. What are our resources and what could we impact? So we're asking a lot. We're doing a research, is basically. We're in that very early stages. So I've got some of these just to show that, you know, these aren't set in stone. These are just dotted lines. Hey, could we go there? Could we go here? Could we go there? Which of these is the best? All that's being vetted. Sometimes it's distance. And again, the words on the slide are become a different talk. We look at land use. How is the environment being used? So we're looking at the databases of environments. You can see the Badlands is right here. Missouri River over here, kind of the Black Hills in this area. Look at the land use. Look at what part of the land, where's the least impact to our social economic status and how land is being utilized. Federal and state lands. If it's a federal land, we got NEPA to deal with. State also has regulation. Each state has individual regulations we'll be dealing with. So those are going to be, hey, were you getting near any of these state parks? Are we going through any BLM lands, tribal lands? I think all this missed tribal lands, but for the most part at this point, national grasslands, all these we can't impact without us thinking through this process. And then culturally. So this is the cultural team that works with me. These are some of the vetted kind of directions, and we put a little buffer around them, and they've identified using the databases and our knowledge of what's there. But there's important to know that a lot of places, like many areas with low population, seem to have fewer sites because there's less research. We don't know what our resources there. They haven't been encountered. We're not going in blindly. We will be doing field work before we choose, or once we choose an area, because we know there are resources we don't have information on. This is our best guess from the databases. We'll look at endangered species. This is the data that we were provided. We asked for this, paid for this information from the people who hold it, saying we'd like to know what's out there. We're not going to tell you what the balloons are, and I don't know what all the balloons are, but we want you to know that these are areas that we know that we have species, and they're somewhere in that bubble. So it's kind of high level at this point in time. We'll get more details as we choose a route or a direction or alternative, but right now it's high level, and I couldn't tell you what some of these bubbles are. But again, the problem is there are endangered species out there that never been studied, because in areas where there's less people, less populations, no parks, there might be species we don't have on this map yet. We got a lot more work to do. And this was me just breaking down the what we know about each county, and this is just randomly some of the data. It's not particularly for any of those lines. Just which species do we know are encountered there, because I'm looking at a very blurry level. They won't give me details. And I know that these are species of concern. That's the level I'm at. So that's where we are. And Cheryl, if I'm not saying that correctly, please jump in. But I wanted to thank you guys for giving me this opportunity.
Thank you so much, Ken. Yes, it is a very detailed process to help us in decision making as we go ahead with a project. And again, as we get federal agency involved, obviously long-term funding will be required from the federal government for a project such as this. We know we're going to be involved with NEPA, and it will be that agency, in all likelihood, Reclamation, who will help guide that NEPA process and say, we need to do more work here, or I think it'll be an EA, not an EIS. Those are all the sorts of things that are in our future as we begin to work more and more on the project. With that, though, we have a few minutes for some questions, if any of you have questions for Ken.
See, I did such a great job. Nobody has any questions. It's perfect. No, if you guys have any, seriously, even any things I said or things I said incorrectly in there or was confusing.
This particular area is my area of expertise as well. And one of the things I was thinking, Ken, you showed all the federal agencies, and the common denominator is that all federal agencies have to follow the same format. Now they all interpret it a little differently, but that those laws that Ken shared with you have to be followed by each federal agency. And so there's consistency among projects throughout the country, and that you don't have one agency deciding to go rogue and find other ways to uh, do some of their projects and things like that. So,
Yeah, as an ecologist, and I kind of drove this home in the talk because it's biased for me to think that we as a society and our children's and their children's children, you always hear that stuff, that this seems like a lot of work. It is, but that's how serious we know we have to work with the environment as our population grows and that animation keeps going. Um, this isn't a stagnant process. And no matter what we do moving forward, we have to think of the consequences of our decisions and how we do things. And that's what I like about NEPA, is that it is looking at the big picture. Sure, it can be overbearing and it can be hard to work with and getting all this work done. And yeah, I'm part of that. But I realize that in the end, we are making the best and wisest decisions we can. That's all we can in NEPA. And that's why I do like the process. Um, it's not perfect. When I put those regulations up there, one of the things I noticed were raindrops and stuff that I didn't talk about. That is literally like all the wetland or water acts through time, and they evolve. All these processes are not stagnant. Everything we talk about as far as regulations is an evolutionary process of us to learn how to work with the environment. We are still learning. My field of ecology, I met some of the founders of ecology. Eugene Odom died in his 90s. I worked with him at the University of Georgia. He is one of the founding fathers of the science that I do. That's 2 generations, 3 generations are now. We're not the most knowledgeable people working with the environment. We are a new science. And that's kind of weird to think. We know more about engineering than we know about how the environment works. We know more about chemistry than how the environment works. And I've spent 30 years studying this, and I still don't know half of the things I wish I knew.
one of the things too that I've found, Ken, is that if you take appropriate steps in planning at the beginning of the project, ultimately you save yourself time and money in the long run. And it you might view it at the beginning to say, oh, if we could just go out there with a shovel today, that would be great. It gets started. But having these extra steps, and it typically, our firms, our teams really are good about getting to the heart of the issue and getting those studies done and getting these processes underway. But once that's done, then you feel confident that you're on a good path for the project again, and it will save you in the long run time and money as you go forward.
That's an important point that I didn't put in here, that thinking through a process makes you make better decisions. And in a sense, that can make and save you large costs in the end. It's a good point.
Any other questions that might be out there?
Well, as always, I would enjoy your feedback. If you guys ever say, hey, you could cover this better or something, I always like to hear what people think. It's been a while since I've taught a class.
Thank you. It comes right back, I can tell, Ken. So I just want to remind everyone that we do keep recordings of these educational presentations on our website. It'll take a day or so to get up there. And that, of course, at any time, if you have questions, don't hesitate to contact us. And our website are the initials of Western Dakota Regional Water System, WDRWS.org. Thank you again for joining us. Our next one will be in January, we're actually going to go to the second Friday in January just because of the calendar. And we will have a legislative panel at that time to take a look at water issues coming up in the 2025 legislative session. Thanks again, everyone. Have a great weekend. And again, thank you for all your interest and support in Western Dakota Regional Water.